Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Geoff Parker. I'm a professor of engineering at the Thayer School at Dartmouth College, and I'm also the interim faculty director of the Arthur L. Irving Institute for Energy and Society, also at Dartmouth. So today, we are set for what I am sure will be an insightful discussion on the future of energy and climate policy with two veteran policy experts.
You don't want to say old?
No, no. So
Not
joining
yet.
us is Dan Reicher, a senior fellow here at the Institute and a former Assistant Secretary of Energy for Efficiency and Renewables, who has served under three presidents in various energy roles. We're also joined by Susan Bodine, who has held senior positions under two administrations at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, including as Assistant Administrator of the Office of Enforcement and Compliance and as Assistant Administrator of the Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response. Susan has also held senior staff positions for Senate and congressional committees. We have, at this moment, 55 people online. I suspect many more will be coming. I'm going to be starting with a few questions to kick things off with our panelists, and then we will open the discussion to you and your questions. Our original plan was to use the chat feature, which is apparently disabled, but happily the Q&A feature is up and running. And then if you use that, we can work them into the conversation. So before I hand this over to, for introductions for Dan and Susan, I want to just quickly mention that we have a new Master of Energy Transition degree that was recently approved, and that's going to be launching in fall 2025. And this is an exciting and comprehensive program that combines policy, business, and technology to prepare leaders for clean energy transition, jobs and occupations. So applications are open now, and we very much hope that if you or someone you know might be interested, please check it out. And the link is right there. So with that, I'd like to give Dan and Susan each 2 minutes to introduce themselves. So Dan?
Well, good afternoon, at least on the East Coast. Very pleased to be here. And normally I wouldn't mention my job straight out of college, but I did have the honor in a very low-level staff position to work for then Dartmouth President John Kemeny at the President's Commission on the Accident at 3 Mile Island. A very exciting way to start the working world. After law school, I worked for federal judge, was an assistant attorney general in Massachusetts, and then went to the Natural Resources Defense Council for about 5 years and did a fair amount of litigation there. I joined the Clinton transition team and ended up at the Department of Energy, first as the Deputy Chief of Staff, then Chief of Staff of the department, the Acting Assistant Secretary for Policy, and then went through a Senate confirmation and became the Assistant Secretary for Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. After the Clinton administration, I went to a venture-backed wind energy company, and also actually with the Dartmouth College, we started the first clean energy project investment fund in the United States called New Energy Capital. Got a nice offer from Google and moved to California, where I was Director of Climate and Energy Initiatives at Google, and then went to Stanford, where I set up a new Center on Energy Policy and Finance at the Stanford Business and Law Schools. And then most recently, and it's the position I'm in now, along with the role I play at Dartmouth, I'm in a program at the new Dorr School of Sustainability at Stanford, and also working with a clean energy project investment fund based in California. So good to be here. And I will pass it over to Susan.
Sure. So I too have a long and checkered career. I did start I am a lawyer also. Started my career in a law firm in DC. And then in 1995, I moved to Capitol Hill to work on environmental issues, actually, for the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee. I was on the Water Resources and Environment Subcommittee. I ended up staying for 11 years and was the staff director of that subcommittee for the last 5 years. And it's relevant to the energy space, not just because of like Corps of Engineers, Clean Water Act permitting, but also because of EPA Clean Water Act permitting, but also Corps of Engineers permitting, plus Corps of Engineers water resources, what projects, which include a lot of environmental projects as well. From there, I went to EPA. This was in President George W. Bush, his second term, and I did go through a Senate confirmation also, and headed up the office that had all of the cleanup programs as well as all the emergency response programs at EPA. When I left the Bush administration, I went into the private sector, back to a law firm, paid for 2 incredibly expensive private school educations, including Dartmouth, by the way. But so that, that worked out. And when I had only one kid in college, I decided that I didn't need to work in a law firm anymore, and I went back to the Hill, but this time I went to the Senate side. I was the Chief Counsel for Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. That's the committee that has all of the environmental jurisdiction, as well as Public Works, as well as the infrastructure jurisdiction, which again includes Corps of Engineers. And so again worked on Water Resources Development Acts on the Senate side as well. I left the Senate in 17, and I went back to EPA, this time as the assistant administrator for the Office of Enforcement at EPA. Again, we had to go through another Senate confirmation, but it was my committee doing the confirming, so it wasn't quite so bad. And then, of course, at the end of the Trump administration, left the administration and left the agency, and I'm now back in the private sector, working for a firm called Earth and Water Law.
Okay. So back to my point, we have 2 very senior people from the DC world, both administration and Congress. So we have a Trump administration, and that's coming again. We've got a Republican Senate and what looks to be a Republican House. So that raises the obvious question of where would you anticipate possible shifts, as well as continuity in energy and climate policy. So Susan, I'll pop that to you first and then over to Dan.
Well, I'm going to answer first on the, within the, the executive branch, and then talk about Congress. Within the executive branch, you can be assured that within the various agencies, everyone is rebranding what they do, because that is what agencies do. And I know Dan knows this too. They're going to rebrand so that it doesn't sound, so that it's something that's more appealing perhaps to what they will anticipate, their incoming leadership will be on the political side. And so, if something was all about, reaching net zero, now it would be about energy security, safety, but you can do the same programs, you've just rebranded them. So I'm sure within the agencies, they're all busy doing that to keep their programs going. In Congress, and I do anticipate, the House is not called yet, but the tea leaves look like it will be Republican. But it's going to be really tight. If I had to put money, I would say 220 to 215. But I don't know. That's a guess, but an educated guess. That's incredibly narrow in the House. Senate, I anticipate the final one will be 53-47, also very narrow, which makes it harder to do things, except for reconciliation. And if the House and Senate stay, or if the House goes Republican or stays Republican, then there is an opportunity for the incoming Trump administration to work with the House and Senate on a reconciliation bill. Reconciliation bills are all about money. They are not supposed to be about regulation. They're not supposed to be policy bills. They're supposed to be about raising money and spending money. But the Inflation Reduction Act was, of course, carried on reconciliation, which is why you can get it through with just one vote. And so that, so what's the money that's in there could be shifted around, and the tax credits that are in there could be eliminated, and that or shifted to different, or continue with tax credits, but shift them to something else. So all that's possible, but margins are tight and compromises will have to be made. And you have, different people, Senator Collins will be in charge of the Appropriations Committee. Senate Finance Committee will be Senator Crapo. I mean, there'll be lots of different interests, and we're going to talk later about corporate interests, but a lot of corporate interest, and that will have influence as well. So I don't see a wholesale elimination of the programs within the Inflation Reduction Act. I do definitely see some of the money repurposed, and tax credits are so hard to get rid of because for Congress, because they immediately create this constituency and vested interests. So whether they can eliminate the tax credits, I don't know. They might be able to repurpose those, to rename them, distribute the money differently. But clearly that'll be a big target. Whether ultimately the change is significant remains to be seen, but the new administration and the House and Senate will say that it's a significant shift. Whatever really does happen. Let me just stop there. There's a lot more to talk about, but I want to give Dan a chance.
All right. Well, thank you, Susan. Let me start with this. I think Donald Trump has made very clear both his climate skepticism and his support for increasing fossil fuel production in the U.S. And I think he'll act on both those sentiments. In light of this, I think the question here, what's the fate of climate and clean energy policy under President Trump, is going to likely have many moving parts. Both what the new president can do administratively and also where Congress has the lead. And on the administrative front, I think there are multiple steps that the new president is likely to take. First, cutting agency budget requests. I think about my old DOE Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, and that's a place where I think we could see pretty deep cuts. I do think eliminating key programs is a potential. For example, at DOE, eliminating the Loan Program Office, potentially, the Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, the ARPA-E Energy R&D program, and the Grid Deployment Office. Some conservative groups have in fact recommended that President Trump freeze all the activity at the Energy Department's loan program. And that'd be a big deal because the office, as of this past December, had roughly $210 billion in loan authority to help promote new technologies. Third, I think we could see firing career personnel as part of the downsizing of the government that Trump plans to undertake with the help of Elon Musk. And fourth, and critically, I think we could see real weakening, or in some cases, the elimination of recent agency rulemakings adopted by the Biden administration. This is the EPA regulation of carbon emissions from both vehicles and power plants, the Department of Energy appliance and equipment efficiency standards, and wide-ranging Department of Interior policies on cutting greenhouse gas emissions from fossil resources, enhancing renewable energy generation on federal lands, and carbon sequestration on public lands and waters. We're also likely to see, and Trump has really emphasized this, he did so in September, we're likely to see a rescission of unspent funds under the Inflation Reduction Act, which was, as I think everyone knows, Biden's signature climate initiative. Turning directly to Capitol Hill, I think there's several problematic steps that President Trump might take. First is nominating a slew of key senior appointees at EPA, Interior, Energy, Treasury, and Ag, and those will be folks who share President Trump's anti-climate views. And with the new Senate firmly in Republican hands, confirmation of those appointees should be relatively straightforward. Second, I think there are elements of the Inflation Reduction Act that President Trump cannot unilaterally rescind, like the broad range of tax credits, but that Congress might act on to eliminate some of those. This congressional action, however, could be challenging given the increasing support that clean energy investment enjoys across the nation, and particularly so if Democrats take control of the House, something we should know shortly. But as you've heard from Susan and Geoff, that's fairly unlikely at this point. And lastly, even before President Trump becomes president, permitting reform legislation is pending in the current lame duck session of Congress, and that contains critical provisions on siting long-distance transmission lines that we need for solar and wind, and also support for LNG exports. But utilities are all over the map in terms of support for the pending bipartisan Senate bill. Environmental NGOs are split. And finally, with Donald Trump's election and ours taking control of the Senate, prospects for permitting legislation are pretty limited at this point. So with that, I'll turn things back to Geoff.
Well,
Geoff,
I'll
do you
just
mind if
let, absolutely.
instead of going to another question, because there's so much on this.
Exactly. There's a
subject.
lot. So why don't we have a
Right.
little rejoinder here?
Absolutely. And it's not rejoinder. I'm not saying I disagree. I may disagree with characterizations, but I don't disagree with what Dan said. First on the regulatory piece, Congressional Review Act, if you have, the only time it ever comes into play is when you have a change of administration and you have a House and Senate that's of the same party of the new administration. And so, you know, you had that when President Bush was elected, you had it, I guess when President Biden was elected, but it was
His first 2 years.
Just for 2 years, right. So there's an opportunity there. It has a look back of 60 legislative days. Nobody knows what that means. Probably around May 1. And definitely the Biden administration worked really hard to get a bunch of rules out. You'll see a lot of rules that got kicked out at the very beginning of May, at the very end of April. But the ones that aren't in that deadline, there will be targets. I'm sure the committees right now are being asked to put their target list together. Not everybody will, not all the rules will be subject to even those expedited procedures under the Congressional Review Act, because the most valuable commodity in Washington, frankly, is Senate floor time. And the Senate will have to take floor time to get their nominees through. Yes, after Harry Reid changed the Senate rules, yes, it's only a 51 votes, but it takes time. It takes 3 days. And so you're
For
not
each of those.
Yes.
Yes. Right.
Yeah, it takes forever. So that's going to be an issue. So everybody has to kind of they'll dial back on what their CRA list is. But nonetheless, depending on what the date is, you know, you could have the power plant rule, as Dan said. There will not be a second power plant rule for existing gas plants. I think that's pretty much a given. CAFE standards, you know, the fuel efficiency standards, perhaps. But remember, there's also litigation, like on the power plant rule. The Trump administration can shift their position in litigation too. They can say, "Oh yeah, you're right. Carbon sequestration is really not a proven technology, and therefore, you know, you challengers are correct in that this rule, you know, it violates the law." So there are other ways, but again, absent a Congressional Review Act. So let's just say not litigation, not Congressional Review Act, then the agency, a new administration has to go through notice and comment rulemaking. That takes forever. They have to be very careful, as all the lawyers on the call know. They have to provide a reasoned explanation for why they've changed their position. That's the State Farm case. Under Loper-Bright, the new, you know, this past term, there won't be deference to the agency's interpretation. The judges will decide themselves what they think the best interpretation is. So we will continue to see regulatory whiplash again. I mean, with the last few presidential administrations, we've seen that. New guys come in trying to waste a lot of time trying to undo what the prior guys did. And we'll see that again. maybe that the dust will settle because whatever the litigation ends up, the courts will tell us what the best interpretation is. I don't know for certain or not. And well, maybe I'll just stop there.
But to be clear, what you're referring to, the State Farm case, which altered the standard under the Administrative Procedure Act,
Right.
it altered the standard for this kind of review and revision of.
Loper Bright, yeah.
So I think that, as you say, we don't know that what the best, what's the quote they use? The best view.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
So
judges get to decide.
yeah, the judges get to decide, not the agency. So that will be a new and important
Yeah.
dynamic.
Oh, permitting reform. Okay, on that, I think that the Republicans will once again show that they can shoot themselves in the foot, and will not, and the permitting reform won't advance. It won't continue to get the bipartisan support, with the idea that you'll get something better in a new Congress, and that never happens. So, I'm not, if I were advising anybody, and I'm not, I would say, oh no, do the permitting reform now. But my belief is that they won't.
Yeah, which is sad that it won't get done, because it got out of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee with a 14-3 vote.
I know,
It's an
bipartisan.
extraordinary piece of bipartisan legislation that's sitting there.
Yeah.
Nobody thinks it's perfect, but an awful lot of people think it's pretty good. So I think that will be a sad result of.
Yeah, and Senator Barrasso will not be the chair. He'll move on to become, I guess, whip. It'll be Senator Mike Lee. I don't know. Yeah, they should do it now.
Yep. Agreed.
Well, that's actually a pretty good pivot point, where we can move on and talk about bipartisanship. I mean, given the polarization that we are experiencing, and some of these whiplash phenomenon, where do you see, if any, areas of bipartisan agreement that could help push forward our clean energy transition? And if so, what compromises would be needed, and what areas offer some of the best potential for progress?
So I'll start.
Go ahead, Susan.
Okay, sorry. I started off talking about rebranding. So clearly I would argue that the issue of climate needs to be rebranded from a, net carbon neutral by 2035 or whatever, to energy security, health, safety, reliability, talking about how you can achieve those objectives. Even if your tools end up being the same, the idea, I just don't, this is my personal view, that net carbon zero doesn't resonate as a goal for, it probably everyone on the call it resonates for, but it doesn't resonate necessarily for people across the country. Whereas they care deeply if they're being flooded. They care deeply, if you've got hurricanes coming through, and the fact that we had the inland floods, the North Carolina. I mean, that's a big eye opener. Somebody could argue, well, that's weather, not global climate change. It doesn't matter. People were harmed. People's property was destroyed. People were hurt. They were injured. People died. So yeah, so those kinds of issues will lead to action, and that whether that means trying to shift everything away from fossil fuels, or whether it means increased adaptation measures, resiliency. I mean, clearly, I think there'll clearly be bipartisan support for that. And then on the issue of mitigation, trying to reduce the carbon footprint, again, what would get bipartisan support is going to be the message that no, we're securing our energy future in a reliable way, which, in my, again, personal opinion, means that the transition has to be perhaps slower, taking all of the reliability issues into account, which doesn't mean you don't do the transition. And of course, we'll talk later about corporate interests on that. But so you still do it, but it's not you certainly don't say that it would be the expense of this of the energy prices spiking like they have in California.
So on bipartisanship, I actually would start with technology, what you might call bipartisan energy sources, like nuclear, hydropower, geothermal, and these low carbon energy sources might not face the same cutbacks that I would expect in a Trump administration and a Republican-led Congress that wind, solar, batteries, EVs, et cetera, might face. You know, I think as most know, nuclear is enjoying a renaissance with multiple projects proposed across the country and two new reactors now online in Georgia. Geothermal, interestingly, is gaining support in petroleum-focused states like Oklahoma, especially with the recent application of technologies developed for oil drilling. Hydropower has a strong presence in some Republican-leaning states like Idaho, where it provides 43% of all that state's electricity. And I should also mention carbon capture and sequestration, which has gotten a big push from Republicans, but also enjoys some support among Democrats. On the policy and finance fronts, there's been a rising tide of clean energy project investment with both public and private investment, especially in red states, with all the associated benefits to jobs and local economy. And this has stimulated increasing Republican support and therefore bipartisan support on Capitol Hill for elements of the Inflation Reduction Act. And I found it very interesting that in August, 18 House Republicans wrote a letter to the Speaker of the House objecting to repeal of Inflation Reduction Act tax credits pushed by members of their own caucus. And I'll read you what they said. Energy tax credits have spurred innovation, incentivized investment, and created good jobs in many parts of the country, including many districts represented by members of our conference. So you can see how this huge increase in the investment that's being made, public and private, in clean energy is shifting sentiments, you know, among increasing numbers of members of, you know, the House and Senate on the Republican side. So I think that dynamic will continue to play in a whole variety of ways.
One of the things that we talked about in the setup here is kind of the shift potentially from denying climate change to acknowledging the problem and then the opportunity that creates. And one area maybe we could dive into a bit is kind of this adaptation or mitigation dichotomy that and how things get framed around those.
So I'll start again. So the shift is because constituents can see changes. Like, you know, Senator Murkowski has always been concerned about climate change because when she goes home to Alaska, her native villagers tell her things are changed and the walrus aren't coming. They're not where they used to be. And, you know, the tundra is not the same. So she's always had that concern. But again, with, you know, 2 hurricanes coming within a week, you know, in Florida, or 2 weeks, anyway, 10 days. And then, of course, having the hurricanes hit inland, so it's not just a coastal issue, that generates a shift, I believe, in viewpoint. And then with that shift, the shift is climate change happening or not, to, okay, it's happening now, what can we do about it? And that's an opportunity for a conversation. That's an opportunity for creating bipartisan policy. Now, maybe I'm could be Pollyanna. What I haven't, I'll just throw out the counter argument is that, particularly in the House, there are a lot of very strong fiscal conservatives. So that'll be the counterweight, and the House is going to be really tight. So it'll be hard because anything, you know, if you're spending money and not reducing the deficit, policy will be hard to do because of a large caucus in the House that is going to want to reduce spending. But I think, but on the other, but again, repeating myself, if people's constituencies can see it and are hurting, then they will be impelled to do something about it.
Yeah, and adaptation and mitigation I look at in the following way. Adaptation is critical in a sense because we can't turn off global warming, even if we were to turn off all carbon emissions. But it's sort of a near-term step. And we've really got to put a lot of emphasis on mitigation. We've really got to do all that can be done in cutting those carbon emissions that are affecting weather, that are affecting climate, and causing us to have to invest in adaptation. We got to get to the heart of the matter, which is mitigation. And that's improving technologies, putting the right policy on the books, and making sure we've got adequate capital to get this whole thing done. So yes, I think I'm quite certain we can find bipartisanship when it comes to the money that the federal government can help with when states get into trouble over hurricanes. But we've got to keep our pedal to the metal on mitigation, or we're going to be looking at more and more and more problems like we've seen with the hurricanes, and more money that are being spent on adaptation and not solving the underlying problem.
Well, let me pivot then. So we've been talking a lot about Capitol Hill and Washington and the administration. So let's talk a bit about the role of state policy. So in particular, some large actors like California have often been out in front of, say, the federal government in energy and climate. How do you see that playing out in the coming years? Will there be more sort of attempt for policy innovation? And then, what on the counter side, will there be more of an attempt to try to rein those state actions in?
I'll let Dan take the lead on this one.
Well, thanks. And, I think the states may well play the biggest role in frankly, resisting President Trump's efforts to undo climate progress. And they did exactly that in Trump's first term. And they have, fairly significant legal authority and some resources. Just this week in the election, California voters backed a ballot initiative to create a $10 billion climate bond for both environmental and climate-related projects. In Washington state, voters upheld a very ambitious law to push polluters to cap their fossil fuel emissions. So, things are moving in the states, and I think we'll see more. And I found an interesting statistic. 60% of the country, measured by sales and power generation, is covered by either state laws or utility pledges to achieve zero carbon emissions in the next couple of decades. So the states have been aggressive to date. This will drive wind, solar, storage, and other clean energy growth. And interestingly, even more conservative states without these laws or pledges will see growth, are seeing growth based on the competitive nature of clean energy sources. Texas is today outpacing California in solar development and has long been the nation's leader in wind power deployment. But while many states will step up to fighting climate change and deploying clean energy, there's frankly a limit to what they can do. And worse, I think the states could see many kinds of direct pushback from the Trump administration. And at the top of that list is Trump's attempt to revoke California's special authority to set stricter than federal clean energy standards for cars. President Biden undid President Trump's last attempt at this, but recently Trump made it clear earlier this year that he'll give it another try. So there's both opportunities And there's real challenges when it comes to what the states can do on their own in the absence of federal support from the White House and Congress.
I mean, states, as you point out, have a lot of their own authorities, and they can certainly set goals. They sometimes that will have backlash. I moved out of DC area. I now live in Maine. There's backlash on the solar tax credits because the funding for those tax credits is coming by increasing everybody else's utility bills, people who have propane or oil, and there's a backlash. And there has been a backlash in California on their energy prices. So there's a limit politically to what states can do on their own. Frankly, I think there's a limit politically as to what the federal government can do as well. I'm sure creating responsibilities and non-discretionary duties and creating the opportunity then for people to sue on that. That's a different, you won't see the Trump administration doing that. So yes, state action. Yes, it's limited to, within what they can do. Some of that might get litigated, although there was a recent Supreme Court decision about raising hogs, because California had a law that said you can't sell in the state of California if you raise your pork in a certain way, and the out-of-state poultry, not poultry, producers, pork producers challenged that on an interstate commerce basis, and they lost. It's like, no, California can set their own rules. Okay. So.
Yeah. Well, you make a fair point about kind of unfair allocation of the costs of certain incentives. Solar and wind, for example, I think there are some legitimate concerns. On the other hand, as the price of those technologies continues to drop, I think, the market itself is going to see the uptake. And on top of that, the radical shift we've seen in the interest of the investment community in putting, private sector capital in these sorts of things. So I think these are things like tax credits, they'll be with us for a while, but I think over the long haul, we're going to get to costs of these technologies that make them highly competitive straight up. So I think that will help a lot. But I think, I think states are going to kind of be the bulwark for a while. And, and I'm hopeful that there will be some relatively, positive relationships between the new White House and new Congress and a host of states, because, so much good can come from that kind of cooperation.
So let me pivot and talk a bit about, or invite you to speak a bit about corporate and non-governmental organization influence. We have hundreds of major corporations, and including the tech giants, and that's a special category, and large retailers, often working in tandem with NGOs, have really moved out and taking the lead on decarbonizing their own operations. With the impact of adding 80 gigawatts of clean energy to the grid, and influencing policy. So how do you see sort of the future of corporate and NGO commitments to decarbonization as potentially shaping or influencing policy? And then do you see the potential for backpedaling, or what are the limits to that influence?
So Dan clearly is the expert on this one. I'm just going to say a few things, which is the theory of tax credits is, you're priming the pump, corporate funding will come in. The reality is that they never go away. We're still, we still have tax credits for, the oil industry. I mean, they just never go away, which is because you get, the vested interests. Although, again, the theory is market failure. We have to do something to put a thumb on the scale, and then the market will take over. Whether the market can take over completely and we can actually get rid of tax credits, I haven't seen it, but that is the theory of what is supposed to happen. On the corporate side, yes, again, corporations are going to act in the interest of their shareholders. They are going to act to make money, but there's money to be made. And therefore investments are going to be made. And Dan knows more about that than I do.
Well, it is quite extraordinary, the corporate commitment that's the boom we've seen since 2020, 2021. We're now looking at planned investment of roughly $500 billion since the IRA was passed in 2022. And we also have clean energy jobs increasing at about twice the pace of overall U.S. employment. So it's compared to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, when we first started this Clean Energy Project Investment Fund in the U.S., the first one, people looked at us pretty skeptically. But today, this is a major industry, major investment opportunities being looked at by both Wall Street and Silicon Valley. The IRA, that breakthrough piece of legislation is expected to pour as much as $1.2 trillion into technologies to fight climate change and factories to build that technology. We're also seeing the greatest surge in U.S. factory construction in half a century. So you just sort of look at the strength and the size of this change that's occurred really in the last 5 or so years. Even Republican-led states like Montana and Utah are writing climate plans to secure federal support and the manufacturing that it can stimulate. And interestingly, and this is the thing that surprised me when I first saw this, and about 80% of the money spent so far as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act has flowed to Republican congressional districts. For example, electric vehicle plants in Georgia, battery plants in South Carolina. And where we find ourselves is that both lawmakers and business leaders want to protect that investment and the jobs they bring. And again, I mentioned those 18 Republican members of the House who objected to the repeal of the IRA tax provisions. And I think there's a political dynamic to this as well. Given Republican sentiment like this and how close the House will be balanced between R's and D's, I think President Trump may simply not have the votes he needs for a major repeal of the IRA, given the strength of this investment and the jobs that it's created. There's also what I call the Elon Musk and RFK Jr. factor. Elon, as Tesla's CEO, might convince Trump to temper his strong dislike of electric vehicles in order to keep Tesla's sales humming. And it's worth noting that way back in 2010, a tiny and struggling electric vehicle company called Tesla received a $465 million loan from the DOE loan program to buy a shutdown California auto assembly plant. And the rest, of course, is EV history. And RFK Jr., if he puts on his rather tattered NRDC alumni hat, might just soften Trump's climate skepticism. But on that one, I am not holding my breath. But as an offshore wind developer and investor, I am losing deep sleep over the trouble Bobby Kennedy might cause on that front. On the NGO front, environmental groups are hard at work, I would say, albeit reluctantly, on how they'll address President Trump on environment, clean energy, and climate generally, and on specific plans on how to address the key vulnerabilities that this community faces. And finally, how they will collaborate to do whatever pushback they need. I found an interesting quote from one prominent NGO leader who said, a legitimate vein of opportunism, along with recognizing the human toll of warming, will continue to drive private investment in clean energy, though companies may be less likely to advertise their climate commitments, meaning in the Trump administration. So I think there's some real opportunities here. Again, this dramatic business opportunity that we've seen develop is, I think, what's going to sustain this more than almost anything else, and cut back on the likelihood of major damage being done by the incoming administration and Congress to the progress we've made.
Let me shift, and we're coming into to the end of our webinar, but let's talk a little bit about kind of the international scene. There've been a number of global agreements. They sort of get agreed to, they get unagreed to. You know, that goes a bit back to some of the whiplash that we opened with. You know, how important are those at this point in time to driving meaningful global and domestic action on energy transition and climate mitigation? And if some of the existing ones, like the Paris Agreement, are set aside, what other international collaborations might help accelerate progress?
Well, I'll start and then then hand it over. On Paris. So will the incoming Trump administration withdraw from Paris? I believe the answer is yes. How meaningful that will be in the United States, not at all. I think, as it has been discussed, the corporate interests are driving reductions, technology is driving reductions, increase investments in things like nuclear driving reductions. Will it matter internationally? Probably. And not necessarily for the industrialized countries, but for the developing countries. If the United States isn't going to be, spending a lot of money, giving money to other countries, asking them to kind of leapfrog over, the Industrial Revolution and somehow get into a new clean green economy, which would require enormous investment, then yes, you're not going to see this as much progress, because people in developing countries want the quality of life that Americans have. The quality of life that Americans have was developed on an industrial base that was fossil fueled, and now it's this country is rich enough to be able to go beyond. Other countries aren't, and so yes, it will matter. The other argument, is if the United States isn't the leader, then we're sending a terrible signal. I've heard that argument made over and over and over again. But that isn't to say that other countries can't step up. But the issue is going to be money. The issue is going to be, will there be a fund? And I would argue, I would project that United States contribution to that would go down dramatically.
I would take issue with Susan's point that it's not meaningful in the U.S. I do think, because it guides global cooperation, U.S. and other countries, and frankly, I think it provides a real yardstick for progress worldwide and country by country. As Susan said, I agree. President Trump's expected to withdraw the U.S. from the agreement. And there's one scary new twist on that action that I had not realized until I got ready for this meeting, and that some of President Trump's allies are also exploring whether the new president could also remove the U.S. from the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that's what allows the U.S. to take part in global climate negotiations. And most fundamentally, this could make it harder for a future president to rejoin the Paris Accord, as it may require Senate approval at that point. So, there could be some deeper things going on that could put us in an even tougher situation. But at the same time, I think if President Trump chooses to cede U.S. leadership, um, I'm confident there will be several nations ready to fill the void and new opportunities for U.S. states, businesses, investors, and other non-state actors to step up. Thus, shortly after President Trump was elected in 2016, and in anticipation of um, Trump pulling us out of the Paris Agreement, 6 U.S. states agreed to disclose greenhouse gas emissions and meet the Paris Agreement targets, and more signed on after that to this effort. The other thing is that the second withdrawal from the agreement will definitely throw a wrench in the works of this critical effort, and I think give other nations an excuse to do the same. And obviously, it comes at a time when the impacts of the climate crisis are being felt even more strongly and at vastly greater expense than 8 years ago. And finally, I think we're going to have an initial demonstration of the effects of a Trump presidency on climate policy when the COP29 International Climate Agreement kicks off Monday in Baku. I think the U.S. will immediately see its clout drop with Trump's clear intention to exit the Paris Agreement, and we'll be watching if other nations signal the same. And finally, it's worth noting that the U.S. ceding global climate leadership and cutting investment will hurt our efforts to compete with China and other nations that are racing to dominate the massive new market for clean energy technologies. Long haul, that may be one of the biggest effects of this in and out that we're demonstrating when it comes to the Paris Agreement.
I would say that the argument needs to be made, which you were making, Dan, which is the economic argument in favor, saying, oh, you know, whether it's cheaper to spend money now than spend money later. You know, the investments spur jobs in the United States. I mean, there needs to be an economic argument made. I'm not saying I know enough to be able to make it, but that's what's going to be compelling. It's not a goal saying, you know, that the world is coming to an end unless we achieve net neutral by a certain date. It's going to be, this is better for the American people. That that a lot of that is an economic argument. And frankly, the economic argument will definitely resonate with the Republicans in the House and Senate.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. And I think, you know, the now versus later is a really important one because, you know, putting this off, putting, frankly, mitigation off, as we've talked about earlier, means we've got to spend more money on adaptation, you know, build bigger walls and, you know, raise buildings and all of that sort of stuff. So, yeah, I think ultimately the big opportunity here, given where the new administration and new Congress may push things, is the strongest economic arguments we can make for real action, substantial action now, rather than, you know, when the crisis is even more substantial.
So we have one question that's coming in a couple of flavors, and let's try to handle this one fairly quickly because we're coming into an end. But are you aware of any Project 2025 sort of playbook or recommendations that are legally feasible that would have an impact on some of the clean energy and climate goals? Just sort of the quick version.
I don't know what you mean by legally feasible. A lot of there's the rhetoric of do this immediately, which is different, which translates to the executive branch, whoever's in charge, has the authority to direct its employees to do certain things. But if you're talking about rules and regulations, then there's a process, and that's notice and comment rulemaking. And then, of course, there's an opportunity to challenge in the courts later. So it takes forever. So the sweep of the pen is executive order telling people to start the process. It's not getting rid of stuff on day one, or, you know, achieving particular goals on day one. So if that's what you meant legally, then yeah, there is no legal authority to undo a rule by signing, an executive order. So the answer is no, but it's yes, as in I can direct the efforts of, a new president can direct the efforts of his or her administration to focus on certain things.
Yeah, and I would just say the 2025 plan is hundreds of pages long, and there's all sorts of ideas that, you might be able to rely on existing authority, or you might have to create new authority. I already mentioned one, this notion of trying to pull us out of the 1992 Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's came out of that 2025 report, and it could have a pretty significant impact.
Yeah, but I do have to say that didn't come out of the transition. It didn't come out of the campaign. It came out of the Heritage Foundation.
Oh,
And that there are there actually are platform documents that are publicly available, and I'm certain there's some overlap, but if you're going to look at a playbook, I would direct you to the papers that the president-elect's people have put out, and not what the Heritage Foundation has put out.
yeah, agreed. It's an external organization, but it shared a lot of people with, the folks going into the administration. So we'll see.
So that is a great finishing point, and I just want to thank you, Dan. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, audience, for your participation and the questions. So we're planning another webinar. This is going to be in February, focused on the role of nuclear energy, and we can dive more into sort of the forces of AI and the tech giants that are kind of becoming almost the level of state actors. If you haven't already joined the Dartmouth Energy and Climate Alumni Network, please do so using the QR code. And we will also email you a very brief survey evaluation of the webinar. Please take the 1 to 2 minutes that it will require to complete that, so that we have the feedback we need rather to to continuously improve. So once again, Susan, Dan, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and participating today.
Thank you to Geoff, to Susan, and to the whole audience.
Yes, I agree. Thank you, and thanks, Dan. Great to get to know you.
Thank you, Susan. We'll be in touch.
Yes. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.